The greatest empire in history was built by a murderer, sustained by women with more rights than most countries have today, and burned down at a drunken party. Every word of that sentence is true. In the year 500 BC, the Persian Empire controlled 40% of the world's population, from the borders of India to the shores of Greece. From Egypt to Central Asia, no empire before it had ever come close to this scale. No single political structure had ever governed this many human beings, and at the center of it all was a city that most people today have never heard of. Persepolis. Say it, Persepolis. In ancient Persian, Parsa. The city built on a platform of carved stone in the mountains of what is now Iran. The city where 23 nations sent their tribute every year. The city with a treasury so full that when it was finally looted, it took 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to carry the gold away. The city that was destroyed in a single night by a party. Subscribe now, because everything you think you know about how empires fall is about to be wrong. Number 1. The man who built it stole the throne, and then carved his version of events into a cliff so nobody could argue. In 522 BC, the Persian Empire was in crisis. The king was dead. A man had appeared claiming to be Bardia, the dead king's brother, and had taken the throne. Darius, a nobleman, a military commander, a member of one of Persia's 7 great families, disagreed. Darius and 6 other noble conspirators killed the man on the throne, claimed he was an impostor named Gaumata, and installed Darius as king. Whether the man they killed was actually an impostor or the legitimate heir is a question historians have debated for 2,000 years. We will never know for certain. What we know is what Darius did next. He marched to a cliff face at a place called Behistun and had an inscription carved into the rock 65 meters above the ground, high enough that nobody could reach it to alter it. The inscription, in 3 languages, explained that by the grace of Ahura Mazda, Darius was the rightful king. The impostor had been killed, and order had been restored. He did not just take the throne, he carved his version of history into a mountain and made it permanent. Number 2. Persepolis was not built by slaves. Every instinct says it should have been. The largest palace complex in the ancient world, a carved stone terrace 450 meters long and 300 meters wide, cut into the side of a mountain, 72 columns 20 meters high, supporting a cedar roof in the great audience hall alone. Surely slaves built this. They did not. Thousands of clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Persepolis record something that changes everything we assume about the ancient world. The workers who built Persepolis, the Kurtash, were paid employees. They received fixed wages in grain, wine, and silver. They had supervisors. They had performance records. They had sick days. And the women who worked on the construction, women who served as team leaders on the building sites, received wages equal to or higher than men at the same skill level. Women who gave birth during the construction period received extra rations of wine and grain as maternity support, a paid maternity leave system. In 500 BC, this is not mythology. This is administrative record, baked into clay tablets by an accidental fire 2,000 years later. Number 3. A message sent from Persepolis reached the Aegean Sea in 7 days. The Persian Royal Road stretched 2,699 kilometers from the capital at Susa to the city of Sardis on the Aegean coast. Along this road, 111 relay stations were positioned at 1 day's ride apart. At each station, fresh horses waited, fresh riders waited, day and night without stopping. A message could travel the entire length of the road without stopping. Riders changed at each station, horses changed at each station, and the message kept moving 24 hours a day. Rain, heat, darkness, the system did not stop. 7 days from Persepolis to the edge of Greece. A traveler on foot would have needed 3 months. Think about what that meant for an empire. A rebellion breaking out in Egypt could be reported to the king in Persepolis, and a military response ordered within 2 weeks. Instructions from the center of power reached the edges of the empire faster than most medieval European kings could communicate with cities a few hundred kilometers away. Herodotus, who was Greek and had no reason to compliment the Persians, wrote about this system with unconcealed admiration. It was the fastest communication network in the ancient world by a significant margin. It held together an empire of 40 million people across 3 continents through the speed of a horse and the discipline of a relay. Number 4. Part of the annual tax payment was 500 castrated boys. Every year, 23 nations sent tribute to Persepolis. The amounts were fixed, precise, carved into the stone staircases of the Apadana so that every diplomat who visited could see exactly what every other nation was giving. Babylon paid 1,000 talents of silver and 500 castrated boys to serve as eunuchs in the royal court. Egypt paid 700 talents of silver plus all the grain from the Nile's communal lands to feed the imperial armies. The province of India, the richest, paid 360 talents of gold dust extracted from the sands of the Indus River. Cilicia paid 360 white horses, one for each day of the sacred calendar, and 140 talents of silver. This was not optional. This was the price of existing within the empire's borders. The 23 nations carved into the staircase were not guests. They were subjects, and the stone told them exactly what that cost. Number 5. The empire had too much gold, and it destroyed them. Persepolis held the largest treasury in human history. Gold and silver flowed in from 23 nations every year for 2 centuries. The reserves grew and grew and grew, and almost none of it went back out. The kings of Persia hoarded their treasure. They melted incoming tribute into solid ingots and stored them in the vaults beneath the palace. They did not invest in local economies. They did not build industries in the provinces. They did not circulate the wealth. The result was economic suffocation. The provinces sent their silver to Persepolis and never saw it again. Local markets dried up. Inflation rose. The people of the empire became progressively poorer, while the treasury of their king became progressively fuller. The greatest financial flaw of the Persian Empire was not poverty. It was having too much money and not knowing what to do with it, except lock it away. Number 6. Xerxes burned Athens and was then murdered in his bed. In 480 BC, Xerxes I led the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled into Greece. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, a strait of water 1 kilometer wide, to move his forces from Asia to Europe. He cut a canal through a peninsula to let his fleet pass safely. The engineering alone was unprecedented. His forces burned the Acropolis of Athens, the temples, the civic buildings, the sacred spaces of the city that considered itself the pinnacle of civilization. Then his fleet was destroyed at the Battle of Salamis by Themistocles, who used the geography of a narrow strait to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. His army was defeated at Plataea the following year. Xerxes went home. 15 years later, in 465 BC, he was murdered in his bedroom by Artabanus, the commander of his own royal guard, with the help of a court eunuch. His son was then manipulated into killing his own brother before discovering the truth and having Artabanus executed. The man who burned Athens died not in battle, not in conquest, in his own bed, betrayed by the man whose entire job was to protect him. Number 7. A eunuch ran the empire for years and killed 2 kings. By the 4th century BC, the Persian court had been hollowed out by decades of dynastic murder, incestuous politics, and the growing power of court officials who held no official title but controlled everything that mattered. The most powerful of these was a eunuch named Bagoas. Not a general, not a prince. A court official with no army of his own, and no blood claim to anything. In 338 BC, Bagoas poisoned King Artaxerxes III and most of his sons. He placed a surviving young prince on the throne as a puppet. When the puppet showed signs of independent thought, Bagoas poisoned him too, along with his entire family. In 336 BC, he then selected Darius III, a distant cousin with no direct line to the throne, as the next king. A man chosen specifically because he seemed controllable. Darius III discovered the plan to poison him as well. He forced Bagoas to drink the poison himself. The eunuch, who had killed 2 kings and installed a third, died at the hands of the 3rd king he had created. Number 8. The last king of Persia abandoned his family 3 times. Darius III was not a coward in the conventional sense. He was a man placed in an impossible position by decades of court decay, military neglect, and a treasury full of gold that had not been spent on soldiers or training for generations. The army he commanded was enormous in number but structurally outdated, cavalry and infantry designed for a style of warfare that Alexander's Macedonian phalanx made irrelevant in a matter of hours. But the record of his military failures against Alexander is difficult to read without a kind of horrified sympathy. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, when Alexander's cavalry broke through the Persian line and charged directly toward the command position where Darius stood, Darius turned his chariot and fled. He left behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his personal treasury. His family did not have time to escape. Alexander, who was 23 years old at the time, captured the mother, wife, and daughters of the great king of Persia. He treated them with respect. He sent word to Darius that his family was safe and would be treated as royalty. It was an act of calculated magnanimity that historians still debate, genuine respect, or the most devastating possible humiliation of an enemy. Darius III never saw his family again. He fled again at Gaugamela in 331 BC, abandoning the field before the battle was fully decided, leaving his army to be destroyed without him. And then, in the summer of 330 BC, his own satrap, a man named Bessus who had served him loyally for years, had him arrested, chained, and stabbed on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. Bessus left the body of the last Achaemenid king to be found by Alexander. Alexander reportedly wept when he found the body. He gave Darius III a royal funeral. His enemy's last dignity came from the man who had destroyed his empire. Number 9. Persepolis fell without a fight because the treasurer surrendered. In January of 330 BC, Alexander's forces arrived at Persepolis. The mountain pass leading to the city had been defended by the local satrap Ariobarzanes in a desperate last stand that historians have compared to Thermopylae. He held the pass with a small force, inflicting significant casualties on the Macedonians, before being outflanked through mountain paths shown to Alexander by local prisoners. When the Macedonian army reached the city itself, the man responsible for the treasury, a Persian official named Tiridates, sent a message to Alexander offering to surrender the city and its contents in exchange for his life. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the greatest empire the world had ever known, was handed over by a bureaucrat who did not want to die. Number 10. It took 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to carry the gold away. For 5 months, Alexander's army camped in Persepolis and systematically emptied the treasury that 2 centuries of tribute from 23 nations had filled. The ancient sources, Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, agree on the figure: 120,000 talents of gold and silver in raw ingots and ceremonial vessels. To transport this wealth, Alexander requisitioned 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels brought expressly from Babylon and Susa. The caravan stretched for kilometers across the Persian plateau. When this gold entered circulation in the Mediterranean economy, it caused immediate monetary disruption. Markets that had been calibrated to existing gold supplies were suddenly flooded. Prices shifted. Trade patterns changed. The economic consequences of Alexander's looting were felt from Greece to Egypt for a generation. Number 11. A drunk woman burned it down. In May of 330 BC, 5 months after entering Persepolis, Alexander held a banquet for his senior officers. The drinking was extensive. The celebration was intense. At some point during the evening, an Athenian woman named Thaïs, the companion of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, who would later become king of Egypt, stood up and gave a speech. She said that it would be a fitting act of historical justice if Alexander burned the palace of Xerxes, the same Xerxes who had burned Athens 150 years earlier. She said it would be an honor that a woman of Athens, the city Xerxes had reduced to ash, put the final torch to the heart of the Persian Empire. She said the world would remember it. The room, full of drunk Macedonian generals who had spent months in the richest city they had ever seen, responded with applause. Alexander, drunk, stood up. He took a torch. He walked to the nearest building and set it on fire. His officers followed. Thaïs threw her torch immediately after Alexander. The cedar beams of the Apadana, the great audience hall where 23 nations had once presented their tribute, caught fire. The flames spread to the columns. The columns spread it to the adjacent palaces. The wind carried burning fragments across the terrace. Within hours, the complex that had taken decades to build, that had survived 2 centuries of the greatest empire the world had known, was ash and collapsed stone. One ancient source, the historian Arrian, argues this version is wrong. He says Alexander made the decision coldly and deliberately, in a formal council of war, as a calculated act of propaganda, to signal the permanent end of Achaemenid power to every subject nation that still wavered. We do not know which version is true. Both might be partly true. What we know is that by morning, Persepolis was gone. Number 12. The fire that destroyed it also saved it. Here is the final irony. The administrative buildings of Persepolis contained thousands of clay tablets, the daily records of the empire, wages, rations, travel orders, tax records, the names of workers, the payments to women on maternity leave, the salaries of the men who built the columns. Clay tablets are fragile. Exposed to air and moisture over centuries, they crumble. When Alexander's fire burned through the buildings, the clay tablets were buried under collapsing walls, and the heat of the fire baked them. It turned soft administrative clay into hard terracotta. It accidentally transformed perishable records into permanent artifacts. The fire that destroyed the greatest empire in the ancient world simultaneously preserved its most intimate daily records for 2,000 years, until archaeologists excavated them beginning in 1931. The man who burned Persepolis became its archivist. The night that ended the Achaemenid Empire was the same night that made it possible for us to know how it actually worked. That is the story of Persepolis, the empire built by a murderer who carved his justifications into stone so high on a cliff that nobody could reach them to dispute them. Sustained by workers who were paid fairly, and by women who had rights that most of the world would not see again for centuries. Rights that were simply administrative reality in 500 BC, and then vanished from the record for 2,000 years. Destroyed from the inside by a eunuch with poison, a king who abandoned his family on 3 separate occasions, and a treasurer who surrendered a city to save himself, and burned to the ground at a party by a torch thrown by a woman whose city the empire had burned first. If a story this strange, this complicated, and this human caught your attention, there is more waiting for you. My previous video is about the city that survived 23 sieges in 1100 years, and finally fell because of an unlocked gate. That story is Constantinople. Go watch it now. And if you want more stories like this, civilizations the world forgot, cities that should not have existed, empires that fell in ways nobody predicted, every video on this channel is waiting for you. Stay with me.